She was only 6 years old when the unthinkable happened behind a closed door in New York City. The story of Lisa Steinberg is not just another crime. It is one of the most haunting child abuse cases in modern American history, a tragedy that shook the city to its core and forced an entire nation to question how such horror could go unseen. Before we begin, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments below. I want to know who's joining us for this journey into one of the darkest chapters of the 1980s. In Greenwich Village, New York, Joel Steinberg worked as a criminal defense attorney. He lived with his partner, Hedda Nussbaum, a former children's book editor. The pair presented themselves as a family, raising a little girl named Lisa and later a younger boy. Lisa had been born in 1981 to her biological mother, Michelle Launders, who had turned to Steinberg to arrange an adoption. Instead of placing the baby with another family, Steinberg and Nussbaum kept her. No formal adoption was ever completed, leaving Lisa in a legal limbo that would later weigh heavily in court proceedings. Contemporaneous accounts and later trial testimony described the household as unstable and violent. Neighbors, teachers, and medical professionals noticed troubling signs. Lisa sometimes appeared with bruises, a black eye, or unkempt clothing. School staff reported concerns about her attendance and health. During the trial years later, jurors were shown photographs and medical evidence that depicted not only Lisa's injuries, but also the extensive injuries that Nussbaum herself endured. Prosecutors argued that the home was marked by long-term domestic violence and control. Steinberg's own professional life had also unraveled. By the time of his trial, he had been disbarred, though he continued to present himself to some as an attorney. Press coverage consistently described him as a disbarred lawyer, underscoring the collapse of his public credibility alongside the private turmoil inside the apartment. The apartment itself, located in Greenwich Village, would soon become central to police reports and trial testimony. Responders would later recount what they found there in November 1987. A battered child, an injured partner, and conditions that revealed a household in deep crisis. Its proximity to St. Vincent's Hospital also mattered, as that was where Lisa would be rushed once emergency responders were finally called. Lisa's biological mother, Michelle Launders, remained a quiet but steady figure in the background. She attended court sessions during the trial and later pursued a civil case in her daughter's name. Judges and appellate courts consistently noted that Lisa had never been legally adopted, a fact that gave Launders the right to claim her daughter's body after death and later to sue Steinberg successfully for damages. By October 1987, the outward routines of this Greenwich Village family concealed a dangerous reality. Teachers and neighbors saw the signs, but the full extent of what happened behind closed doors remained hidden until the night of November 1st, 1987. That evening began a chain of events that would be meticulously reconstructed in court, in medical records, and in eyewitness testimony. The hours that followed would become the focal point of one of New York's most infamous child abuse cases. On the evening of Sunday, November 1st, 1987, the small Greenwich Village apartment became the scene of events that would later be dissected in detail during trial and appellate review. According to court findings, Joel Steinberg struck Lisa, then 6 years old, on the head. The blow caused a severe brain injury. Testimony and medical evidence later confirmed that this trauma was the cause of her coma and eventual death. After the assault, Lisa lost consciousness. Instead of seeking medical attention, Steinberg and Nussbaum delayed intervention for many hours. Prosecutors later emphasized this delay as a central element of his criminal liability. The child lay incapacitated in the apartment without timely emergency care, while the adults continued their activities. Inside the home, conditions revealed themselves as dire. Lisa lay unconscious in a bedroom. Her younger brother, a toddler, was present in the apartment. Nussbaum herself was in poor physical condition, bearing visible signs of prolonged physical abuse. She would later testify that she was also beaten on that night, further incapacitating her ability to respond effectively. Neighbors recalled unusual quiet and a sense of unease about the household. Later testimony indicated that while Lisa lay gravely injured, Steinberg left the apartment at least once during the night. One of his departures was to walk the family dog. The ordinary routine of taking the dog outside contrasted sharply with the emergency unfolding in the apartment, a detail emphasized by prosecutors to illustrate his disregard for the child's condition. The night stretched into the early morning hours of November 2nd. Hours passed without a call for medical assistance. Lisa remained unresponsive, lying in bed with the severe head trauma untreated. The boy was unattended, and Nussbaum, weakened and battered, was unable or unwilling to act. Steinberg maintained control over the apartment, refusing to summon help. By dawn, Lisa's breathing had become shallow, and her condition showed unmistakable signs of a medical crisis. Yet the adults still did not immediately call for emergency services. This failure became a defining aspect of the legal characterization of Steinberg's conduct. Not only the initial assault, but the reckless neglect that followed. It was not until late morning on November 2nd, after more than 10 hours had passed, that an emergency call was finally made. By then, Lisa's condition had deteriorated beyond recovery. This long delay, reconstructed through witness accounts, police logs, and medical testimony, formed the backbone of the prosecution's case. It showed not only the act of violence but also the conscious decision to ignore the urgent need for medical treatment. Together, the blow to the head and the withholding of care created the chain of causation that the court later affirmed as the legal cause of death. The neglected hours of that night and morning sealed the fate of the child at the center of the case. They would also become the defining measure of Steinberg's culpability in the eyes of the jury and later appellate courts. On the morning of November 2nd, 1987, after hours of delay, a 911 call was finally placed from the Greenwich Village apartment. When paramedics arrived, they found 6-year-old Lisa Steinberg lying unresponsive. Her breathing was shallow, her pulse faint, and her body cold to the touch. She showed clear signs of severe head trauma. Time was already working against her. The responders quickly realized that this was not simply a medical emergency, but a scene of neglect and violence. Hedda Nussbaum was present, and her appearance startled the paramedics. She was emaciated, covered in bruises, and bore injuries that spoke to long-term abuse. She deferred entirely to Joel Steinberg, who had made the emergency call. Also in the apartment was Lisa's younger brother, still in a soiled diaper and showing signs of neglect. Both children were removed at once. Lisa was rushed to St. Vincent's Hospital, just blocks away. Paramedics worked to stabilize her during the ride, but she remained unconscious. At the hospital, doctors ran scans that revealed massive swelling in her brain. They concluded that she had been struck in the head and had remained untreated for many hours. Had she been brought to a hospital immediately, the swelling might have been contained and her chances of survival greatly improved. The long delay was fatal. She was placed on a ventilator, but the prognosis was grim. Police had already been notified. Detectives arrived to secure the apartment, photograph the conditions, and interview the adults. They found drug paraphernalia, clutter, and evidence of neglect. Neighbors told officers about bruises they had seen on Lisa in the past, and about arguments overheard in the home. At the hospital, detectives observed Steinberg's cold demeanor, which stood in sharp contrast to the emergency around him. Their suspicion quickly hardened. For the next 3 days, Lisa remained on life support. She never regained consciousness. Her biological mother, Michelle Launders, was located and called to the hospital. She had given her daughter to Steinberg at birth to arrange an adoption, and this was the first time she had seen her in 6 years. She stood vigil as doctors explained that the brain damage was irreversible. On November 4th, Lisa was declared brain dead. Machines continued to keep her body functioning until final confirmation was made. On November 5th, 1987, she was officially pronounced dead at St. Vincent's Hospital. She was 6 years old. The press seized on the story immediately. Newspaper headlines across New York carried photographs of the battered child, the gaunt partner, and the disbarred lawyer now under suspicion. The delay in medical care, the shocking appearance of Nussbaum, and the revelation that Lisa had never been legally adopted gripped the public. The case was no longer only about a tragedy in one apartment. It was about a system that had failed to protect a child. As Lisa's life slipped away in the hospital, police and prosecutors were preparing charges. Steinberg was first arrested for assault, but, after her death, was charged with homicide. Nussbaum, who had also been taken into custody, was later positioned as a key witness rather than a co-defendant, as prosecutors recognized her as a victim of prolonged abuse. The short span between November 2nd and November 5th was the turning point. A single 911 call exposed not just the final injury but years of violence and neglect, opening the way for one of the most closely followed criminal trials in New York during the late 1980s. When detectives from the New York Police Department's 6th Precinct and the Manhattan Child Abuse Squad entered the Greenwich Village apartment on November 2, 1987, they stepped into an environment that revealed far more than a single emergency call suggested. What they found was documented in photographs, inventory logs, and later described in sworn testimony. A scene that bore the marks of violence, neglect, and chronic dysfunction. The apartment was dim, cluttered, and disordered. Police reports noted debris scattered throughout, unwashed dishes, and an atmosphere of neglect. On one wall, officers later testified, they found stains and marks consistent with repeated impact. The space that served as the children's bedroom contained a small bed where Lisa had been found unconscious, alongside scattered toys that seemed abandoned. The younger boy's crib was in poor condition, and his soiled diaper at the time of removal underscored the neglect investigators now documented. On that first day, officers photographed Hedda Nussbaum extensively. The images would later become some of the most powerful exhibits at trial. Her face bore multiple bruises. Her skin was mottled with marks that doctors later cataloged as signs of both fresh and healed injuries. Her teeth were broken and decaying. She was thin to the point of frailty with untreated medical conditions, including a leg infection that doctors said should have been addressed months earlier. Police concluded that she had been systematically abused for years. Steinberg, by contrast, appeared outwardly composed and controlled. He was interviewed by detectives at the hospital and later at the precinct. His initial account of events, that Lisa had suddenly collapsed and that he did not know why, immediately conflicted with the medical findings from St. Vincent's Hospital. Doctors told investigators that the girl's injuries were consistent with a severe blow to the head, not with natural causes. In the days immediately after the emergency, investigators interviewed neighbors and acquaintances. Several said they had noticed Lisa with unexplained bruises and black eyes. Others recalled Nussbaum's deteriorating appearance, her increasing isolation, and her apparent fear of Steinberg. Teachers from Lisa's school provided statements describing her spotty attendance and visible injuries. These testimonies began to sketch a picture of a child at risk long before the fatal night. The district attorney's office quickly convened meetings with detectives and medical examiners. The autopsy, conducted after Lisa was declared dead on November 5th, confirmed the cause of death as blunt head trauma. The report noted the presence of extensive swelling in the brain, consistent with being struck. It also reinforced what doctors had said earlier. The delay in treatment contributed directly to the fatal outcome. As the investigation unfolded, the irregular circumstances of Lisa's adoption became public. Michelle Launders, her biological mother, gave statements to the press and to prosecutors. She explained how, 6 years earlier, she had trusted Steinberg, then a practicing attorney, to arrange for her baby to be adopted into a Catholic family. She had paid him for this service and believed it had been completed. In reality, Steinberg had kept the infant and raised her as his own, never completing the legal process. This revelation added an explosive dimension to the case. Not only had a child been fatally abused, but she had been living in the household illegally. Reporters quickly latched onto this detail. Newspapers ran headlines about a disbarred lawyer who had not only killed a child, but had done so after keeping her without legal sanction. The irregular adoption gave the public and prosecutors alike a sharper sense of betrayal. It suggested a deception that stretched back to the day of Lisa's birth. Police also documented evidence of drug use in the apartment. Paraphernalia consistent with cocaine consumption was found during the initial search. This supported statements later made by Nussbaum, who said that Steinberg had used drugs heavily and that his abuse often followed periods of drug use. Prosecutors later used this evidence to reinforce their argument that the household environment was one of chronic chaos, neglect, and violence. Within days, Steinberg was formally charged with murder. The indictment alleged that he had intentionally struck Lisa and then failed to seek medical help in a timely fashion, resulting in her death. Nussbaum's role was more complicated. Initially taken into custody, she was soon released and transferred to a hospital for treatment of her own injuries. Investigators and prosecutors came to see her less as a co-conspirator and more as a victim who could provide essential testimony. The press attention was immediate and intense. Photographs of Lisa, bright-eyed in school pictures, were printed side by side with images of Nussbaum in the hospital, battered and frail. The contrast between the innocence of the child and the devastation of the adult woman under Steinberg's control became central to how the story was told publicly. Editorials in New York newspapers began to question how such abuse could have gone unnoticed by authorities. Letters to the editor poured in, expressing outrage that teachers' concerns had not triggered more intervention. During November 1987, as the investigation deepened, prosecutors prepared for what they understood would be a difficult trial. They knew Steinberg was a trained lawyer with courtroom experience. They also knew that the defense would likely argue that Nussbaum, not Steinberg, was responsible for Lisa's injuries. To counter this, they sought to build a case firmly grounded in medical evidence, timelines, and testimony from neutral professionals. By the end of the month, the outlines of the case were clear. The state would argue that Joel Steinberg struck his daughter, ignored her desperate need for medical care, and exercised controlling, abusive power over both children and Hedda Nussbaum. The defense would attempt to shift blame onto Nussbaum and question her credibility. The apartment on West 10th Street, once an unremarkable residence, had become the crime scene at the center of a case that gripped the city. The immediate investigation, from the 911 call through the first weeks of November, produced the foundation of evidence that prosecutors would rely on for years of proceedings. Police photographs, medical records, autopsy findings, and witness interviews formed a body of facts that no amount of legal maneuvering could erase. In the grim stillness of the apartment, detectives had uncovered not just the circumstances of a single night, but the long-hidden dynamics of a household defined by secrecy, violence, and neglect. By the time Lisa Steinberg was pronounced dead on November 5, 1987, the case had already become front-page news across New York City. The story contained elements that shocked the public and fed media coverage. A disbarred attorney accused of killing the child he had kept without legal adoption, a battered partner who appeared as much a victim as a suspect, and a 6-year-old girl whose school photographs now stared out from newspapers beside words like tragedy, abuse, and murder. The public reaction was swift and visceral. Neighbors who had quietly wondered about the family now spoke openly to reporters. Some said they had noticed Lisa's bruises and black eyes but hesitated to interfere. Others recalled hearing shouting and suspected violence inside the home. Teachers from Lisa's school, who had documented their concerns about her injuries and irregular attendance, were devastated. They had raised alarms but lacked the power to remove her from the household. Editorials in New York newspapers soon turned their focus to systemic failures. Why had reports of suspected abuse not led to intervention? The image of Hedda Nussbaum, gaunt and visibly injured, became symbolic of the case. Photographs taken of her as she left the hospital showed a woman so battered that her appearance itself became evidence of long-term abuse. Her broken nose, swollen features, and frail body shocked readers. Many wondered how a woman in such a condition could have been complicit in abuse of a child. Prosecutors came to see her less as an equal participant and more as a witness whose testimony could illuminate the dynamics of control and violence in the household. Meanwhile, Joel Steinberg's public image was starkly different. Press accounts described him as cold and unrepentant. His legal background made him a figure of fascination. Here was a man who once defended clients in court, now himself accused of murder. Stories emphasized that he had been disbarred before the incident, underscoring the fall from professional authority to criminal defendant. As Steinberg was arraigned and held without bail, the legal system began to prepare for a lengthy trial. The Manhattan District Attorney's Office charged him with second-degree murder, alleging that he had intentionally inflicted the head injury on Lisa and then recklessly failed to obtain medical treatment. They also charged him with endangering the welfare of a child. From the beginning, prosecutors knew the case would hinge on Nussbaum's testimony. They sought to establish that she had been so thoroughly controlled and abused that she was incapable of protecting Lisa, making her a victim rather than a co-defendant. Public outrage extended beyond the courtroom. Candlelight vigils were held in Lisa's memory, and advocacy groups called for reforms in child protection laws. The case became a rallying point for discussions about mandatory reporting, school responsibility, and the ability of child welfare agencies to intervene in suspected abuse cases. For many, Lisa's death was proof that the system had failed. During 1988, Steinberg's defense began signaling its strategy. His attorneys suggested that Nussbaum herself might have inflicted the fatal injury. They portrayed her as unstable, unreliable, and motivated by a desire to shift blame. This foreshadowed the battle to come in court, where her credibility would be relentlessly tested. In the months after Lisa's death, Michelle Launders remained present but quiet. She had reclaimed her legal rights as Lisa's mother in order to arrange for burial, and her grief was visible at memorials and court hearings. She later pursued civil action against Steinberg, but in the early months her focus was on ensuring that the criminal case moved forward. The case's early legal fallout also affected Hedda Nussbaum directly. Though she had been arrested alongside Steinberg, charges against her were soon dropped. Prosecutors formally declared that they would not seek to hold her criminally responsible for Lisa's death, citing her condition as a battered woman. This decision was controversial. Some critics argued that she had failed to act to save the child, while others believed she was as much a prisoner in the household as Lisa. The public debate over her culpability added another layer of intensity to the case. By the end of 1988, the stage was set for a trial that promised to expose the hidden world of abuse inside the apartment. Public reaction had transformed the case into more than a single tragedy. It was seen as a test of how the justice system handled domestic violence, child abuse, and the accountability of professionals who had once held positions of trust. The early fallout ensured that when Steinberg finally stood trial, the courtroom would be filled not only with lawyers and witnesses, but with a city watching closely, determined that Lisa's death would not be forgotten. Once Lisa Steinberg's death was officially ruled a homicide, the Manhattan District Attorney's Office moved quickly to build a case that could withstand the scrutiny of a high-profile trial. The initial arrest of Joel Steinberg for assault was upgraded to second-degree murder, reflecting the evidence that he had struck the 6-year-old on the head and then failed to summon timely medical help. The indictment also included charges of first-degree manslaughter and endangering the welfare of a child. From the beginning, prosecutors faced a central dilemma: how to handle the role of Hedda Nussbaum. She had been arrested alongside Steinberg on November 2nd, but her battered condition and medical records convinced many inside the district attorney's office that she was more victim than perpetrator. Doctors testified to the severity of her injuries: broken bones that had never healed properly, untreated infections, decayed teeth, and countless bruises. Psychological evaluations suggested she had been subjected to years of domination and control. By early 1988, the decision was made to drop all charges against her and to treat her instead as the prosecution's star witness. This decision was not without controversy. Some critics argued that Nussbaum bore responsibility for failing to protect Lisa, especially given the hours of delay in seeking medical help. Others pointed to the evidence of her own brutalization, saying she had been trapped in the same cycle of abuse as the child. The prosecution ultimately decided that the only path to convicting Steinberg was through Nussbaum's testimony. Her role in the case was reframed. She would describe the violence in the household, the night of November 1st, and Steinberg's refusal to seek help, all from the perspective of a survivor. Steinberg's defense team seized on this strategy as their primary opening. In pretrial filings and interviews with the press, they indicated they would argue that Nussbaum herself was responsible for Lisa's death. They portrayed her as unstable, manipulative, and capable of violence. They suggested that Steinberg was being scapegoated while the true perpetrator was being shielded. This adversarial framing ensured that the trial would revolve as much around Nussbaum's credibility as around the medical facts. The prosecution, for its part, set about constructing a case grounded in physical evidence. Medical testimony would establish that Lisa had been struck with a force strong enough to cause massive brain swelling, and that the delay in treatment sealed her fate. Paramedics, doctors, and police officers were lined up to testify to what they had seen. A child near death, a battered woman, and a toddler in neglect. Neighbors, teachers, and family friends would describe the visible signs of abuse leading up to November 1987. The goal was to show a consistent pattern, not an isolated incident. Pretrial hearings stretched through 1988. Steinberg's lawyers attempted to exclude some evidence, arguing that photographs of Nussbaum's injuries would prejudice the jury. They sought to suppress statements made during his early police interviews, claiming he had not been properly advised of his rights. These motions were mostly denied, though the court carefully limited the scope of certain testimony to keep the focus on Lisa's death rather than Steinberg's character. Meanwhile, the press followed every development. Each pretrial motion, each delay, and each ruling was reported in the city's newspapers. The case had become a touchstone for public debates about child abuse, domestic violence, and accountability. Editorials pointed out that Steinberg, as a lawyer, had once held the public's trust, yet had used his position to take in a child under false pretenses. Letters to the editor argued about whether Nussbaum should testify as a victim or face charges herself. The trial promised to reopen these arguments on an even larger stage. Jury selection was anticipated as a major challenge. Defense lawyers would seek jurors skeptical of battered woman claims, while prosecutors would search for those sympathetic to the dynamics of domestic abuse. Both sides understood that Nussbaum's testimony would be the trial's emotional centerpiece, and each prepared to either bolster or dismantle her credibility. By late 1988, after months of maneuvering, the case was ready to move forward. The indictment against Joel Steinberg remained focused on second-degree murder, manslaughter, and child endangerment. The strategy was set. Prosecutors would argue that he not only inflicted the fatal blow, but then demonstrated depraved indifference by refusing medical care. The defense would argue that Hedda Nussbaum was the real abuser and that Steinberg was being wrongfully accused. The stage was now set for one of New York's most closely watched trials of the decade. In the courtroom, a jury would soon hear evidence of a household where violence, neglect, and control had ended in the death of a child. The battle lines were drawn long before opening statements. A prosecution built on medical facts and battered woman testimony, and a defense built on undermining the only eyewitness who could tell the story. The trial of Joel Steinberg opened in late 1988 in Manhattan, drawing enormous public attention. The courtroom was packed daily with journalists, members of the public, and legal observers. The charge of second-degree murder in the death of 6-year-old Lisa Steinberg promised a battle over not just facts but perceptions, of credibility, of culpability, and of how the law should treat violence within a home. From the beginning, the prosecution laid out its theory. Joel Steinberg, they argued, struck Lisa on the head on the night of November 1, 1987. He then failed to seek medical treatment for more than 10 hours, leaving her unconscious and struggling for breath. This combination of assault and reckless neglect, prosecutors said, demonstrated a depraved indifference to human life, as defined under New York law. They emphasized that Lisa's death was preventable if only medical help had been sought promptly. The defense countered with a strategy that had been foreshadowed during pretrial maneuvering. They aimed to discredit Hedda Nussbaum, portraying her as both unstable and potentially responsible for Lisa's fatal injury. They argued that she had motivation to shift blame onto Steinberg to save herself from prosecution. Their approach made clear that Nussbaum's testimony would be the centerpiece of the trial. When Nussbaum took the stand, the courtroom was silent. Her physical appearance was still marked by years of abuse. She walked slowly, her body bearing permanent damage. She testified about the dynamics of her relationship with Steinberg, describing years of violence, intimidation, and control. She recounted how he beat her regularly, how she grew dependent on him, and how she became unable to act independently. Jurors heard her describe the night of November 1st. Lisa had been struck, rendered unconscious, and lay motionless while Steinberg refused to call for help. She told the jury that she urged him to get medical attention, but he insisted everything would be fine. Her voice cracked as she described waiting through the night, helpless, while the child's condition worsened. The defense cross-examined her aggressively. They pointed to inconsistencies in her past statements, questioned her drug use, and suggested she was fully capable of violence herself. They highlighted that she had not taken action to save Lisa, suggesting that her passivity was evidence of guilt rather than of being a battered woman. For hours, the defense pressed her credibility, aiming to convince the jury that she was untrustworthy. Medical experts followed. Doctors from St. Vincent's Hospital explained the nature of Lisa's injuries. They testified that the child had been struck with force sufficient to cause massive swelling in the brain, and that she had been unconscious for many hours before being brought in. They explained that the delay in seeking medical treatment had been catastrophic, reducing her chance of survival to almost zero. The medical examiner who conducted the autopsy confirmed that the cause of death was blunt head trauma, consistent with a deliberate strike. Paramedics and police officers who responded to the 911 call described what they found in the apartment. Lisa lying unresponsive, Nussbaum battered and frail, and a toddler in neglect. Photographs were introduced into evidence showing the conditions of the apartment and the injuries of both Nussbaum and Lisa. These images were powerful and left jurors visibly shaken. Teachers from Lisa's school also testified. They recalled seeing her arrive with bruises and black eyes, sometimes explaining them away with unlikely stories. They described her irregular attendance and their frustration at being unable to force intervention. Their testimony underscored that the abuse had not been a sudden act but part of a long-term pattern. The defense attempted to counter the medical testimony by suggesting that the exact moment and cause of Lisa's fatal injury were uncertain. They argued that it was possible she had been injured earlier or in a manner inconsistent with Steinberg's alleged actions. They also pushed the idea that Nussbaum's drug use and mental state made her account unreliable. Their goal was not necessarily to prove Nussbaum guilty, but to create enough doubt about Steinberg's guilt to prevent a murder conviction. Closing arguments crystallized the divide. The prosecution told the jury that this was a case about responsibility. A man who struck a child, ignored her medical needs, and let her die. They reminded jurors of the medical testimony that treatment could have saved her. They argued that Nussbaum's battered state explained her inability to act, not her guilt. They said Steinberg's conduct showed indifference to his daughter's life. The defense, in turn, urged jurors to distrust Nussbaum. They said she was the only witness who claimed Steinberg struck Lisa, and her testimony was unreliable. They reminded the jury of her inaction, asking how a truly loving caregiver could have watched a child lie unconscious without seeking help. They asked the jury to consider whether Steinberg was being blamed because he was the easier target. The trial lasted 4 months, with testimony from dozens of witnesses. Each day was reported in detail by newspapers, and the public followed every development. The case had become a test not only of Steinberg's guilt but of society's ability to understand domestic violence and its effects on behavior. When the jury retired to deliberate, they faced a complex question. Had Steinberg's actions met the legal standard for murder under New York law? The verdict they would deliver reflected both the strength of the evidence and the limits of what the law could define as intent and indifference. After months of testimony and intense media coverage, the jury in Joel Steinberg's trial began its deliberations in January 1989. They had listened to doctors, teachers, police officers, neighbors, and most significantly to Hedda Nussbaum, who described years of violence and the night Lisa was fatally injured. Jurors had seen photographs of the battered child and the battered partner. They had heard medical testimony that a timely call for help might have saved Lisa's life. The central legal issue was whether Steinberg's conduct met the definition of depraved indifference murder under New York law. Prosecutors argued that he had struck his daughter, then refused for hours to seek medical treatment, demonstrating total disregard for whether she lived or died. The defense insisted that Nussbaum was not credible, that Steinberg did not deliver the fatal blow, and that there was insufficient proof of murderous intent. After nearly 2 weeks of deliberations, on February 14, 1989, the jury announced its verdict. Steinberg was acquitted of second-degree murder but found guilty of first-degree manslaughter. He was also convicted of endangering the welfare of a child. The jury's decision reflected a conclusion that Steinberg had caused Lisa's death, but without the level of intent or indifference required for a murder conviction. Reactions to the verdict were mixed. Some observers were relieved that Steinberg was convicted at all, fearing that the defense's attacks on Nussbaum might lead to acquittal. Others were outraged, believing that the evidence of prolonged abuse and deliberate neglect should have resulted in a murder conviction. Outside the courthouse, demonstrators expressed anger that the verdict did not reflect the gravity of Lisa's suffering. At sentencing, Justice Harold Rothwachs emphasized the cruelty of Steinberg's actions. In June 1989, he sentenced Steinberg to 8 1/3 to 25 years in prison, the maximum allowed for first-degree manslaughter. The judge condemned his indifference to the child's life and the years of abuse within the home. Steinberg showed little emotion as the sentence was read. The appellate process soon began. Steinberg's lawyers argued that his conviction should be overturned on multiple grounds. They claimed that Nussbaum's testimony was unreliable, that certain evidence had been improperly admitted, and that the jury had been misled about the law. The appellate division of the New York Supreme Court reviewed these claims and, in 1991, upheld the conviction. The court found that the evidence of guilt was overwhelming and that the trial had been fair. Steinberg's case then reached the New York Court of Appeals, the state's highest court. In 1992, the court issued a decision affirming the conviction. The judges wrote that the evidence supported the jury's finding that Steinberg had caused Lisa's death by striking her and then failing to provide medical care. The ruling emphasized that his conduct fit the statutory definition of first-degree manslaughter, recklessly causing death under circumstances showing conscious disregard of a substantial risk. With the appellate process concluded, Steinberg's conviction stood. He began serving his sentence at the maximum security prison in upstate New York. Nussbaum, meanwhile, remained outside the criminal system, continuing to rebuild her life while grappling with her role as both survivor and witness. The verdict and appeals left a complicated legacy. For some, justice had been served. Steinberg was imprisoned for decades, branded forever as the man responsible for Lisa's death. For others, the lack of a murder conviction signaled a legal system unable to fully grasp the dynamics of domestic abuse and the severity of child homicide. The appellate opinions, written in careful legal language, underscored how tightly the outcome was bound to the precise definitions of intent and recklessness under New York law. By 1992, the criminal phase of the Steinberg case was complete. Steinberg was incarcerated, his appeals denied, and Lisa's death officially adjudicated as manslaughter. But the legal story did not end there. A civil lawsuit, filed by Michelle Launders on behalf of her daughter's estate, would extend the case for another 15 years, ensuring that Lisa's name remained before the courts and in the public memory. While Joel Steinberg began serving his prison sentence, another legal battle unfolded in civil court. This case was initiated not by prosecutors, but by Michelle Launders, Lisa Steinberg's biological mother. Having reclaimed her parental rights after Lisa's death, Launders became the administrator of her daughter's estate and sought civil damages against Steinberg and Hedda Nussbaum. The civil lawsuit, filed in Manhattan Supreme Court in 1989, accused both Steinberg and Nussbaum of wrongful death and sought financial accountability for Lisa's suffering. Launders argued that Steinberg's violence and neglect directly caused Lisa's death, and that Nussbaum had failed in her duty to protect the child. Although criminal charges against Nussbaum had been dismissed, civil law allowed for liability even without criminal conviction. From the outset, the civil litigation was symbolic as much as financial. Launders stated publicly that no amount of money could replace her daughter, but she wanted the courts to acknowledge Lisa's suffering and hold the adults responsible in every legal form available. For many observers, the civil suit was a way of ensuring that Lisa's memory remained central, not overshadowed by the debates about Steinberg's intent or Nussbaum's credibility. The case moved slowly through the courts during the 1990s. Discovery and procedural battles consumed years. Steinberg, imprisoned and without income, claimed he had no assets. Nussbaum, struggling to recover from years of abuse and dependent on limited financial support, argued she lacked the resources to pay damages. Despite these practical limitations, Launders persisted. Her attorneys framed the case as a moral stand. Even if monetary collection was unlikely, A civil judgment would serve as a permanent legal record of responsibility. In 2004, after more than a decade of delays, the case reached a critical turning point. Manhattan Supreme Court Justice Lottie Wilkins issued a ruling that Steinberg and Nussbaum were civilly liable for Lisa's wrongful death. The court found that Steinberg had inflicted the fatal injuries and failed to seek medical help, while Nussbaum, despite being a battered woman, had not acted to protect Lisa. The ruling assigned joint liability, though Steinberg was deemed the primary wrongdoer. In 2007, nearly 20 years after Lisa's death, a jury awarded $15 million in damages to Lisa's estate, represented by Launders. The award included $5 million in compensatory damages for Lisa's pain and suffering, and $10 million in punitive damages meant to punish Steinberg and deter similar conduct. The jury's decision was largely symbolic, as neither Steinberg nor Nussbaum had the financial means to pay such an amount. Still, Launders expressed a sense of closure. The courts had officially recognized the full extent of Lisa's suffering and the culpability of those who failed her. The civil judgment also had broader resonance. It reinforced the message that child abuse cases carried consequences beyond the criminal system. It underscored that victims, even posthumously, could be represented in civil court, and that perpetrators could be held liable in multiple arenas of law. For child welfare advocates, the outcome was another example of how the legal system was adapting to address abuse more comprehensively. For Steinberg, the civil judgment was a further blow to his reputation. Already disbarred and imprisoned, he was now burdened with a massive financial judgment that he could never hope to satisfy. For Nussbaum, the ruling reopened public debate about her responsibility. While many still saw her as a victim, the civil court's decision made clear that her inaction had contributed legally to the tragedy, even if her circumstances explained why she had not intervened. By the time the civil case concluded, 2 decades had passed since Lisa's death. Yet the persistence of Launders and her attorneys ensured that the case remained alive in the courts and in public discussion. The civil judgment stood as a testament to her determination to honor her daughter's memory by pursuing every available form of justice. After Joel Steinberg was sentenced and the courtroom doors closed on the criminal trial, the story of Lisa Steinberg did not fade into silence. Instead, it lingered in the city's collective conscience, carried forward in headlines, in legal reforms, in the quiet grief of her mother, and in the uncomfortable conversations about child protection and domestic violence that her death had forced into the public sphere. The tragedy became one of those cases that are remembered not only for the crime itself, but for what it revealed about the systems and people who had failed to prevent it. In the years Steinberg spent behind bars, he was rarely out of the news for long. At first, the coverage focused on the appeals he filed, each one dismissed with firm language by the appellate courts. Later, the attention shifted to his parole hearings, which began in the early 2000s. Each hearing became a minor news event in New York. Reporters detailed the board's deliberations, and each time Steinberg appeared before them, the same questions were raised. Did he understand the enormity of his crime? Did he show remorse? And could he be trusted outside prison walls? The answers were never satisfactory in the eyes of the board. Statements submitted by Lisa's mother were often read into the record, reminding parole officials that Lisa had never been given a chance to live her own life, and that Steinberg had shown little understanding of what he had destroyed. For nearly 2 decades, these hearings ended the same way, with parole denied. Only in 2004, after Steinberg had served more than 16 years, did the board finally grant his release. When the day of release arrived, the media was waiting at the gates of the upstate correctional facility. Photographs of Steinberg, older and grayer but still recognizable, appeared on front pages the following morning. New Yorkers remembered instantly who he was. His attempts to settle back into life in Manhattan were met with resistance. Neighbors protested, landlords resisted renting to him, and public outrage followed him wherever his name appeared. Although he had regained physical freedom, he never escaped the burden of his reputation. The name Joel Steinberg remained a shorthand for cruelty and betrayal, and every move he made after prison was filtered through that lens. The civil judgment that came in 2007, ordering him to pay millions of dollars in damages, added another layer of permanent accountability. He had no resources to meet the judgment, but its symbolic power ensured that, even in freedom, the courts had left him with a legal marker of guilt that would never disappear. For Hedda Nussbaum, the years after the trial unfolded differently. She retreated from public life, scarred not only physically but emotionally. She carried the weight of knowing that she had been present the night Lisa died, unable to intervene. She was free from criminal charges but never free from public scrutiny. Some saw her as a tragic victim, a woman who had endured years of abuse and been broken down until she could not act to save herself or the child she loved. Others saw her as complicit, unwilling to forgive her inaction. The truth lay in a complicated middle ground, shaped by years of control, trauma, and paralysis. Nussbaum eventually wrote about her experiences, publishing a memoir that sought to explain the psychological stranglehold Steinberg had exercised over her. She described her descent into dependency, her isolation, and the terror that defined her daily life. She presented her testimony and her writing as both a personal record and a contribution to the understanding of domestic violence. For a time, she participated in advocacy, speaking about the dynamics of abuse and how women could be trapped by partners who stripped them of agency. But as years passed, she withdrew further, living quietly away from the spotlight, her name still evoking heated debate whenever the case was remembered. Michelle Launders, Lisa's biological mother, carried perhaps the heaviest burden. She had given her infant daughter into Steinberg's care years earlier, believing she was ensuring stability and love. The discovery that Lisa had never been legally adopted, and the knowledge of the horrors that had followed, left her with grief that never lessened. After Lisa's death, she became an advocate for reforms in child welfare. She urged lawmakers to close the gaps that had allowed Steinberg to raise a child outside the legal system, and she supported changes in reporting laws that strengthened obligations for teachers, doctors, and social workers. Her fight was not loud or constant but steady, a determination to ensure that her daughter's name remained a call for vigilance. The civil lawsuit she pursued against Steinberg and Nussbaum became part of this mission. Though it stretched across nearly 2 decades and the damages awarded would never be collected, Launders viewed it as essential. For her, the judgment was not about money but about acknowledgement. The award of $15 million by a jury in 2007, 20 years after Lisa's death, served as an official statement from the courts that Lisa had suffered and that the adults who should have protected her had failed. It was a symbolic form of justice, but it mattered deeply to her. The broader impact of the Steinberg case reached into public policy and culture. It forced New Yorkers to confront the shortcomings of their child protection systems. Teachers had seen Lisa arrive with bruises and had voiced concerns, but those concerns had not been acted upon decisively. Neighbors had heard shouting and seen signs of distress, but intervention never came. These failures were discussed in legislative chambers and led to reforms that clarified mandatory reporting duties and increased oversight of child welfare cases. The case was cited repeatedly in debates about how to balance parental rights with the duty of the state to protect vulnerable children. The case also influenced how the legal system understood domestic violence. Nussbaum's battered condition and her testimony about years of control were used as examples in legal and psychological discussions of battered woman syndrome and coercive control. Her inability to act, once seen by some as complicity, was increasingly understood as the product of years of abuse that stripped her of the capacity for independent decision-making. This recognition shaped not only academic literature but also courtroom strategies in later domestic violence cases. Culturally, Lisa's story was retold again and again. Documentaries, television programs, and true crime accounts revisited the case, ensuring it was not forgotten. Each retelling highlighted the photograph of Lisa as a young girl, smiling at the camera, her innocence starkly contrasted with the brutality of her death. The image became emblematic of the stakes in child abuse cases, the reminder that behind every statistic was a child with a face, a voice, and a life that could be lost if adults failed to act. As the years moved into the 2010s, the Steinberg case was no longer a daily news story but remained present in memory. Law students studied it in courses on criminal law and family law. Advocates referenced it when pushing for new child protection policies. Journalists invoked it when covering new cases of child abuse, reminding readers that New York had once been shaken to its core by Lisa's death. The story never lost its power to disturb, and it never lost its relevance to ongoing debates about how society should respond to domestic violence and child neglect. For the individuals who lived through it, the case defined the rest of their lives. Steinberg, though free, remained infamous, his name inseparable from his crime. Nussbaum, though legally cleared, lived in the shadow of controversy and pain. Launders, though private, carried her daughter's memory into every courtroom she entered and every reform she supported. And Lisa, though her life ended at 6 years old, continued to shape conversations and policies decades later. In the end, the legacy of Lisa Steinberg's case is that it refused to vanish. It demanded recognition of systemic failures, forced acknowledgement of the complexities of abuse, and pressed a city to ask why a child could die in plain sight. It left behind court records, reforms, books, and judgments, but above all it left behind a name that carried weight. Lisa's story remains one of the most tragic and consequential in the history of New York, a reminder written in both grief and law that the protection of children requires vigilance, intervention, and courage from every part of society. And that concludes our look into the case of Lisa Steinberg, a story that continues to raise difficult questions about justice, responsibility, and the systems meant to protect the most vulnerable. If this breakdown kept you engaged, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. It helps more than you know. I'd also love to hear your perspective, so drop your thoughts in the comments below. You've been watching Eternal Obsidian, where we explore some of the darkest and most impactful stories from history and beyond. Until next time, stay mindful, stay questioning, and stay with us on this journey.